Who is the most morally evil character in the Soulsborne series? This is a fascinating question that was put to me by some friends recently when we were in a Discord call, and it really got me thinking. The FromSoft Souls games are world-building masterpieces, and we usually are walking in the shadows of what were, exploring great kingdoms that are long past their glory days. These incredible and rich worlds are populated by fascinating characters of all stripes: gods, kings, queens, knights, witches, madmen, and monsters. What FromSoftware does really well, though, is make a lot of their characters morally grey, like Sister Frida, who has allowed the painted world of Ariandel to decay and rot. She resists its need for renewal, and lets the land fall to rot. Not because she is evil, but because she doesn't want this world to fade. She is holding on to things as they are. But that is not to say that there are many characters within the various games who do widespread harm for their own gain. We have characters within positions of power, like Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, who denied the natural cycle of the world, and misled the undead and pygmies, so that he could retain his own power base. We also have Ranni, who readily sacrifices Godwyn, and inflicts an undying curse upon the lands between, solely to achieve her ambition. Yet while these acts are reprehensible, I think that there are even more villainous characters, who inflict wanton cruelty without any such lofty motivations. In this video, I want to reach into the filth and find the truly evil characters of the Soulsborne universe, those who commit evil crimes and show little or no remorse for their acts. In terms of this video structure, I will choose a character who will serve as a nominee from each of the mainline Souls-like games. This means we will look at Demon's Souls, each of the 3 Dark Souls games, Bloodborne and Elden Ring. Then in the final chapter, I will choose one of these characters, who will take the coveted title of Most Evil Character. This is a little bit different from my usual long-form lore content, but I thought it was a really interesting subject that everyone will have different opinions on, so be sure to let me know yours in the comments below. And if you are interested in additional benefits, such as exclusive videos and early access to videos like this one, then check out my Patreon in the description below. And shout out to my friends Vexidian, Lazago, and Fiendish Doll for first having this discussion with me. With that said, let us jump into the discussions with my first candidate from Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is a game that I have a special love for, as I think its themes and story are unmatched by any of the other games. A tragic tale of human greed and depravity, and many will not know this, but this channel actually started with Demon's Souls lore. And so it is fitting that we start with the very first Souls game, a game that is full to the brim with the worst of human sin. For that is what the demons are. They are the personification of human fault. From greed, to cruelty, to jealousy and violence. Demons take form according to their surroundings, usually drawing upon human emotions, our fears and myths, and in some cases they also draw on the environment itself. In some cases they are created by another powerful demon, and in other cases a human being can take on a demon soul themselves and use its power. Such is the case with Estrella and Alant, with Estrella being the only example of someone's intentions being pure. In most cases, the demons take on our world's worst aspects as their physical form. They are our myths and deeds, given form and hurled back at us, in a scourge that wipes out a once powerful and prosperous nation, Boletaria. And yet for all that, my choice from this game is not actually a demon, not even the old one itself, for the old one is just doing that which is its nature. No, my choice is none other than Old King Alant, the man who brought the scourge of demons upon Boletaria for his own selfish means, damning his entire kingdom to a terrible fate. Countless innocents and his own subjects, sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. Now it does seem as though at one stage Alant was a good man, as he seems to have fostered a chivalric culture in Boletaria. This is most evident in the heroic knights who serve him. Metas, Bior, Valorfax, and Longbow Ulan. Ostrava himself tells us of this golden age, when Boletaria was known as a northern paradise, and the king and his good knights ruled over a happy people. Yet over time, the old king's melancholy and discontent at life itself seems to have overtaken him, and the importance of his knights would be replaced by the likes of the fat officials and executioner Miralda. But there is lore within the game that suggests that Alant was always an evil man. The description of his sword, Soulbrant, reads the following. The soul-rending blade passed down through the Boletaria royal family. It is a black blade that forms a matching set with Demon Brand. After Alant rose to the throne, it was always in the king's hands. Old Alant favoured the blade for the way its power increased the more demonic the wielder's soul became. There are two magical swords that belong to the Boletarian royal family. One good sword meant to kill demons, and one evil sword that consumes the souls of men, a demonic sword. So it is interesting that the description of this sword tells us that even from the start of his reign, Alant favoured this sword. It tells that even from the onset of his rule, Alant saw value in the demonic, and as we will discuss shortly, it is because the old king hated this world and human life. When you first play the game, you are initially in the dark as to how the demon scourge came to the kingdom of Boletaria, and you could infer from the introductory cinematic that the rousing of the Old One was an accident, brought on by Alant's interest in the soul arts, instead of it being a deliberate act. And even the king's son, Ostrava, has come to Boletaria to find his father, and find out how he let this happen. As we learn more, Alant's guilt becomes more apparent. One of the most iconic enemies in the game are the Fat Officials, the demonic ministers who run Boletaria during its downfall. We know that these beings are inhuman, for numerous reasons. Firstly, their very visage is uncanny. Well, not in the remake, but we don't talk about that. But in the original game, these beings are clearly inhuman. Additionally, the description of their crescent axe describes how the ministers wield these axes with unbelievable power, again reinforcing the idea that these are not humans but something more. What is clear is that these officials are tied to the demon scourge, and that they had a hand in Boletaria's downfall. We learn more about them via the official's cap, which reads the following. Fat ministers, who appeared just before demons ran rampant in Boletaria, and ingratiated themselves into favour with King Alant, oppressed the masses with a sly grin. So these officials came to King Alant prior to the Scourge, and then began abusing the population on his behalf. And this is why they are found in Boletaria and Stonefang mines. They are his slave drivers and overseers. The fat officials oversee Boletaria's destruction, and they do it with glee and sadism, symbols of greed and cruelty. Whether or not these individuals influenced Alant to pursue the soul arts is a question that is unanswered. However, the very fact that he would allow them into such positions within his court speaks volumes about his character. When we come to the palace at Boletaria, a fake version of Alant, a demon, remains to watch over the smouldering ruins of his great kingdom. A demon fashioned after Alant's appearance in his prime, yet a being that represents nothing more than Alant's arrogance and thirst for power. The false king is a demon fashioned by the true king himself, and this is something we learn directly from Alant, as after we defeat the false king demon, Alant refers to it as his demon. We can combine this information with dialogue from one of Urbane's followers, found in the Nexus. She tells us that it was King Alant himself that led the demon scourge against Boletaria, after being abroad on business. Our conclusion is that Alant purposefully woke the Old One, became a demon, and then created his fake double, who was the one who led the demon army against his own kingdom. Alant directly chose destruction and death, and sentenced his own people to death, for his kingdom to become the plaything of the demons. His son, Ostrava, is on some serious copium throughout his journey. He cannot accept that his father purposefully inflicted the scourge upon his own people. But then Ostrava finally makes it to the throne room and meets the false king himself. When Ostrava meets this being, he realizes the truth, that his father is the cause of all this suffering and the fall of his nation. Countless innocent lives sacrificed to the soul-hungry demons, just for Alant's ambitions. Ostrava is broken by this truth, and he is unable to handle the burden of his father's sins. However, it isn't just power that Alant craves, it is an end to everything. He is a nihilist, who craves the end of the world, and this is made clear to us in our final fight with him, where he says, "Surely you have seen for yourself the pain and suffering that fills this world, but fight poison with poison. God is merciful, and so created the Old One. The Old One will feed upon our souls, and put an end to our tragic realm of existence. Alant becomes a demon, and beckons the Old One because he is bitter, and hates the world, but because of his ego, he cannot just end it himself. No, he must take us all with him, in dramatic fashion. When we finally meet true Alant, within the heart of the Old One itself, we are met with a sickening sight, a pathetic slug-like creature, who still holds on to his precious soul brant, yet he is now too feeble to even wield it properly. This isn't a fight, it is a mercy kill. I remember when I first played this game, the disgusting sight of the king's true form literally made me sick to my stomach. This is what his lust for power has wrought, an exterior that matches his rotten soul. Alant got the power of a demon from the Old One. However, as we can see from the demon souls throughout the game, the form a demon soul takes depends on its circumstances. For me, Alant's demonic form is a reflection of his own nature, a pathetic man, with a rotten moral compass and character. The fight is barely a fight, as this toad form of the king can barely swing his own sword, and having this non-fight as the final boss of the game is a really impactful moment, as in most Soul games you have the most difficult fight waiting for you at the end of the game. Yet here we just put down a pathetic old man, who traded his kingdom and his dignity for power. The demons are nothing more than a reflection of humanity's greatest faults, and Alant is the most rotten example of all. Alant has taken it on himself to bring judgment upon all of creation because of his own nihilism. Alant would watch the entire world burn because of his own misery, instead of defending and uplifting the subjects that he should have served. So I did speak about Gwyn a lot in the opening segment, and I'm sure he will come to mind for many as an evil character. Yet while he was no doubt despotic, I can't help but think that there is a more purely evil character within the first game, and that is Seath the Scaleless. Traitor, Visionary, Madman. All of these titles can apply to the Pale Dragon, who is one of the first characters we are introduced to in the Dark Souls universe. We learn that Seath is one of the ancient dragons, but that he betrayed his own during their war against Gwyn and the gods. The composition of this shot frames this betrayal as an important factor in the defeat of the dragons. Whether he gave Gwyn information regarding the scales of immortality, or he used his own power to destroy large swathes of his kin, is unknown. But either way, the first thing we learn about Seath is that he is a traitor, and a jealous traitor at that. We learn that he is scaleless, and we see him jealously crushing a stone scale, while screaming to the sky. And indeed, Seath's scaleless nature is what drives everything he does. His envy of his immortal kin leads him to betray them, and it leads him to spend the rest of his life desperately researching the means to recreate the scales of immortality. His desperate obsession would not only lead him to go insane, but would also lead him to commit horrific crimes against the people of Anor Londo and Lordran. Crimes that were enabled by Gwyn himself, for it was Gwyn who granted him his position and power, following the War of the Ancient Dragons. We learn this from Seath's Lord Soul, which reads the following. Seath allied with Lord Gwyn, and turned upon the dragons, and for this he was awarded dukedom. embraced by the royalty, and given a fragment of a great soul. Although just a piece, it will still satiate the Lord Vessel. Gwyn gave him a fragment of his own soul, he gave him power, and he raised him to royalty, and the Duke would make his roost in the Duke's Archive, a tower that sits above Anor Londo itself. This tower was once a grand library, which in of itself tells us that Seath's entire existence was focused on learning. He wanted to accumulate knowledge so that he might find an answer to his scaleless form. The truth of Seath's form is one wrought by the coming of the flame, and I have often suggested the idea that Seath was the first ancient dragon born after the first flame, after the advent of life itself. Prior to the first flame, the ancient dragons were unliving creatures of mineral. Life did not exist prior to the first flame, but the advent of flame brought life and death with it. It brought change to the stagnant world of the ancient dragons. This too meant that the ancient dragons would be affected, and so while the ancient versions of them were stone creatures, we can see that their descendants, the drakes, are flesh and blood creatures. Even older ancient dragons like Kalameet are beings of flesh and blood, showing that the flame changed their very nature and form. So for me, Seath is the first of the dragons born after this change, and as the first full flesh and blood member of the dragon brood, he would have been treated differently, as lesser. In time, flesh and blood dragons would become the norm, but at this early time, Seath will have felt like a freak among his people, and so began a lifelong identity crisis that would consume him. This was likely the reason that Seath became the grandfather of sorcery, deep diving into the practice in order to find a way to achieve immortality that would mimic his kin. Seath researched magic for selfish reasons, yet his research into sorcery basically founded the practice, and the Dragon School of Vinheim is so named after Seath. One of Seath's most treasured artifacts is the Primordial Crystal, an object that Logan tells us that Seath pillaged from the ancient dragons. This crystal does make Seath effectively immortal, and is a good stopgap for him, until he figures out how to recreate the scales of immortality. Eventually Seath would pioneer crystal magic, which makes sense when you read the item description of the Homing Crystal Soul Mass, which reads as follows: "The mysteries of souls crystals and the sorceries are deeply intertwined." So the crystal is intertwined with souls, and hence Seath would deep dive into magic, crystals, and souls, so he might discover the truth of the soul and immortality. I would even posit he tried to use crystals as his scales. In the opening cinematic, his skin is completely smooth, and yet by the time we meet him in game, he is covered in crystals, and I think given they are tied to immortality, he covered himself in them as his own version of scales. But none of this seemingly satiated Seath, and he went further. He began to do human experiments to recreate the ancient dragons themselves. Seath's chief servants are known as the Channelers, powerful sorcerers in their own right, who also served as readers for Seath, as he was blind and could not read books himself. Yet they began to serve another purpose, something we learn from their robes, which read as follows: "Robe of the Channelers, sorcerers that serve Seath the Scaleless." Even after the onset of Seath's madness, the Snatchers, as they were often called, ventured to far lands to find suitable human specimens. The Channelers became known as the Snatchers, as they would travel the lands and kidnap people for experimentation. There is indeed a Channeler to be found in the Undead Parish, and it is presumably this one who would kidnap Rhea, as she gets transported from the church to Seath's archives. As to the nature of these experiments, we learn the terrible truth of these at the bottom of the archives, when we come across the tortured beings known as the Pizzaka. Some of these snake-like beings immediately attack us when they are signalled to do so, but some remain in their cage, weeping. That is because these beings were once humans, and they are self-aware of what has been done to them. Their identity is also revealed to us by their drops, as they drop soothing and bountiful sunlight. Both of these are stated to be miracles, that are specifically granted to Guinevere's maidens. These poor souls once served the Princess of Sunlight herself, meaning Seath was bold enough to kidnap members of the royal household. Whether this happened before or after Gwyn had linked the fire is up for debate, though I would argue it is likely that his reign of terror would have become unfettered following Gwyn's departure, as at this stage there would be no one powerful enough to keep the mad pale dragon in check. It's also assumed that the man-serpents, Seath's servants, are experiments of his, and of course snakes are seen as imperfect dragons in the world of Dark Souls. Thus I see the man-serpents as failed attempts to create artificial dragons, but were repurposed as his muscle. In short, I believe that Seath was trying to recreate the dragons, and was only able to make these imperfect serpent men and Pizzaka. Seath's reign of terror continues into Dark Souls 2, as despite being killed in the first game, his soul persists, and it is clear that he is trying to insert his soul into an ancient dragon's corpse, which has been found at the Bright Cove Seldora. The boss of this area is called the Duke's Dear Freya, but unlike the other bosses who seem to be reincarnations of Nito, Gwyn and the Witch of Izalith, Freya does not drop the Pale Drake's soul in New Game Plus. Instead, his soul is found on the ground directly beneath the ancient dragon's corpse that inhabits Freya's lair. Indeed, Freya's soul description instead implies that Freya is the keeper, or defender of Seath, that the spider found Seath's soul, and was granted power by it, and essentially acted in the Duke's interest. The name Duke's Dear Freya is telling us that it is a creature dear to the Duke Seath, not the Duke Seldora. Freya and Seath unleash a wave of death and destruction across the Bright Cove, inflicting violence and horror upon its citizens, just so Seath can secure the ancient dragon's body. Once again, his only concern is to get the body of an ancient dragon, no matter what moral line he has to cross, and what atrocity he has to commit. Seath's destructive influence can be seen throughout all three of the Dark Souls games: a tyrant, a coward, a traitor, and mad scientist who was a truly evil being. Now I actually struggled to choose between Nashandra and Aldea for my Dark Souls 2 candidate, as both commit terrible deeds in pursuit of their goals. Aldea in many ways is much like Seath, an unethical scientist who commits horrific experiments on living specimens in order to uncover the secrets of the ancient dragons. Like Seath, Aldea is enabled by the King of the Day, which in Aldea's case was Vendrick, who also happens to be his brother. Unlike Seath, Aldea is somewhat successful in actually recreating the ancient dragons, but in some ways he is worse than Seath. Because he is not insane, he commits his crimes with a clear head. Yet in Aldea's mind, he is doing all of this for the greater good, so he might find a way to break humanity out of the endless cycle that was instigated by Gwyn. And that's why I have chosen Nashandra over Aldea, because Nashandra seems to orchestrate destruction on a large scale, and she revels in it. We learn a lot of her story from Chancellor Welliger, who tells us that Vendrick rose to power by vanquishing the four Great Ones, and then building this kingdom with their power. Eventually though, Nashandra was drawn to Vendrick because of his power, and she became his queen. We learn that it was she who encouraged Vendrick to plunder the lands of the giants in order to steal the Throne of Want. This decision would have drastic consequences for the kingdom of Drangleic, as the giants would cross the sea in vengeance to reclaim what was stolen, and subjected Vendrick's people to war without equal, leaving this once great nation in ruins. Drangleic was able to defeat and imprison the King of Giants, albeit that is a feat that we accomplish by going back in time via memories. We are the unnamed hero of Drangleic. Regardless, this is a Pyrrhic victory, with Drangleic never fully recovering from this war. Following the war, Nashandra enveloped the land in a subduing dark, and Nashandra's true form became apparent to Vendrick. Realizing she coveted the throne, he fled, going hollow deep in the undead crypt. Nashandra would then usher in an era of dark, and any humans who survived the War of the Giants would go hollow. Nashandra is a being of pure want, something we learn from her weapon, the Scythe of Want, which reads, "A scythe born from the soul of Nashandra. The Old One of the Abyss was reborn in death, split into minuscule fragments, and spread across the land. After regaining their shapes, they crawled forth yearning for strong souls, in search of greater power. Nashandra and her sisters are fragments of Manus, father of the Abyss, who fell in Ulasil at the hands of the chosen undead in Dark Souls 1. And these beings covet power, and so Nashandra, Alana, Nadalia, and Alsana all become consorts to powerful kings in order to latch on to their power. Only Alsana acts in the interest of her king husband, the Ivory King, and she defies her nature for the greater good. The rest bring ruin to the kingdoms they come to rule in a quest for greater power. In Nashandra's case, she callously orchestrates the downfall of both Drangleic and the Giants, just so she can get her hands on her true prize, the Throne of Want. When Vendrick realised the truth of Nashandra's nature, Vendrick fled to the Undead Crypt, so that he might keep the throne from her grasp, as the Throne of Want is sealed behind a door that requires his signet ring. All of this took extreme patience from Nashandra, and so for a long time she kept her true nature a secret. When we first meet her, we see her human form, one that is fair and is very civil. This is the form she used to manipulate Vendrick and the people of Drangleic. All these years she hid her true nature from Vendrick and the kingdom at large, while slowly moving both towards their destruction. Cold and calculating in her design, yet Nashandra is so hell-bent on her goal that she even directs the player character to the Undead Crypt so that we might finish him off and claim his ring. She truly never cared for Vendrick, only for what he could provide her, and that is power. She then also uses us to unlock the Throne of Want before revealing her true monstrous form and attempting to kill us, now that our usefulness has dried up. Nashandra's true form is also quite a shocking sight, and clearly is meant to convey the truly evil nature of Nashandra. I am not saying that the dark or beings associated with it are intrinsically evil. Whilst a lot of the aesthetics may suggest this, the dark is ultimately just another force in the universe. For example, Nashandra's father Manus is not morally evil in a traditional sense, and I would argue that Manus' darkness instead represents the chaotic and unordered nature of the dark. Where light is order and structure, the dark is disorder, and this is reflected in the aesthetic design of Manus and the Four Kings. Both have large, wild growths protruding from their body. Manus' soul item description tells us that his humanity went wild, and in general, I believe that the Abyss in Dark Souls 1 is depicted as something uncontrollable and inevitable, rather than something evil. Even Manus just seems to have been lashing out because he was provoked, and is more akin to a force of nature. However, his daughter Nashandra is clearly portrayed in a different way. She is more akin to evil incarnate, calculating, cold and patient in her act, only discarding civility and human form when violence is needed. And when her true form is revealed, unlike the chaotic and bestial form of Manus, Nashandra's form has a very clear silhouette, one that is to make us think of the Grim Reaper. Her aesthetic design is meant to make it clear to us that she is evil, a person who destroyed a kingdom, used Vendrick, and now used us, before moving to dispose of us. Nashandra is a power-hungry monster, who essentially sacrificed an entire kingdom for her ambitions, and did so with zero remorse and plenty of forethought, and as a result, she absolutely makes my list for the most evil character in Dark Souls 2. I imagine that no one will be hugely surprised at my choice for Dark Souls 3, as Pontiff Sullivan is one of the most obviously overt evil characters in all of Souls history. In Dark Souls 3, We are very close to the end of everything, as the lands past and present are drawn to the fading first flame, like water circling a drain. One of the cities that is drawn to Lothric is Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. In the upper reaches of Irithyll we also find a fragment of the old world, Anor Londo, long past its glory and yet still breathtaking. We come here because we are seeking the Lords of Cinder, and we are here for Aldrich, Saint of the Deep. We first sought Aldrich in his tomb, in the Cathedral of the Deep, only to learn the saint has already fled. We are told by Anri of Astora that Aldrich likely returned home to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Upon arriving in the Grand Cathedral of Anor Londo, we are treated to a horrific sight. Gwyndolin, the son of Lord Gwyn, has been devoured by Aldrich, his tortured form now part of the parasitic saint. While Gwyndolin is definitely somewhat of a villain in his own right, it nonetheless is pretty disturbing to see the once proud god in this state, being slowly digested by the abominable Aldrich. Of course, Aldrich himself is an evil being, an example of human depravity and greed taken to its extreme limit, very reminiscent of the characters and demons we could fight in Demon Souls. And we know from Aldrich's Ruby and Sapphire that he found joy in devouring others. A truly black soul, whose exterior reflects his corrupted soul. Yet behind him there is a character of great intelligence and cunning, who used Aldrich's hunger for his own ambition, and is responsible for inflicting more widespread harm than Aldrich. I of course refer to Pontiff Sulyvahn, the de facto ruler of Irithyll. Sulyvahn now resides in his city of the Boreal Valley, yet we learn from the Snap Freeze spell that he was once a young sorcerer from the painted world of Ariandel. He then left this world and came to the material world, a young sorcerer who would begin to accumulate power, first by going to the profane capital while he was young, before rising through the ranks of the Way of White to the top position he now holds. He has a massive power base as the Pontiff of the Way of White, and leader of the Deacons of the Deep. We learn that it was Sulyvahn who doomed Gwyndolin to this terrible fate via his soul's item description, which reads as follows: Pontiff Sulyvahn of Irithyll imprisoned a god of the old royalty in the abandoned cathedral, to be fed to the devourer. The Pontiff was the one who imprisoned Gwyndolin in Anor Londo, trapping him there for when Aldrich returned. I have always seen this as a usurpation of power by the Pontiff, that he wanted to remove Gwyndolin, so that he might further advance his power. What do I mean by this? Well, Sulyvahn is called a Pontiff, a rank that is equivalent to the real-world Pope. So Pontiff is the head of a church, but which church? Well, it is almost certainly the Way of White, the religion from the first game that worships the old pantheon of Gwyn and his family. There are numerous reasons to believe this, the first being that it is the Occam's razor choice, given this is the main religious institution in the world of Dark Souls. Additionally, Pontiff Sulyvahn essentially rules over Irithyll, a city that is built right underneath Anor Londo. It is the new city of the gods. Given Gwyndolin's presence here, I would suggest that following the events of Dark Souls 1, he continued to survive and essentially became the new head of the Pantheon, and the new locus of worship for the Way of White. Thus it would make sense that the Pontiff of the Church would also be located in this holy city. If the Pontiff was the head of the Way of White, he likely had close and direct access to Gwyndolin, meaning it wouldn't be too difficult for him to organise the god's downfall. Additionally, we get more direct evidence via the Archdeacon set, which states that this outfit is worn by high-ranking members of the Way of White. Additionally, the regular Deacon set tells us that the Deacons of the Deep were not originally worshippers of the Deep, rather they were actually entrusted with sealing its power. Therefore, I believe that the Deacons of the Deep are the remnants of the Way of White Church that has been corrupted by the Deep's influence under the direction of Pontiff Sulyvahn. In having Aldrich devour Gwyndolin, Sulyvahn now has sole control of the Way of White. He is now the custodian of the Old Order, and for all intents and purposes, he is now the master of Anor Londo. The deep is an interesting concept, and it is one I tackled in an old video, and I still stand by my analysis found in that video. In short, I believe that the deep is an aspect of the dark's power, a metaphysical watery abyss in which all dark things sink to over time. Sullivan found power within the deep, and from its power I believe he created the Sullivan beasts, which seem to have once been knights that were rendered into beast-like forms over time. This is suggested by the rings known as the right and left eye of the pontiff. One of these rings is found on a Sullivan beast, the other is found on Vort. This suggests that Vort and the other boreal knights crawl like beasts, because they are being transformed via Sullivan's power. Their relationship to the dark is seen in the Dancer of the Boreal Valley and Vort, who both materialize via a black portal, suggesting that they both have travelled via the deep to get here. In time, I believe all such knights turn into the Sullivan watchdogs, beings of the deep, twisted beyond recognition, a cruel fate to impose upon his own loyal knights, and yet not surprising given that Sullivan finds power where he can, and will use anyone as he sees fit to that end. Additionally, note the precise wording of the eye rings. He only gave these to knights who would leave Irithyll, meaning Sullivan knew that these rings would transform his warriors into beasts, and he didn't want them anywhere near his glorious city. Perhaps because he didn't want his warriors and the people to know what awaited his crusading warriors that he sent abroad. Understanding that Vort, the Boreal Knights, and the Dancer are all his creations, we can begin to realise a truth. Sullivan has been our main enemy since the very beginning of the game, and his reach extends far beyond the Boreal Valley. The first boss we fight is Vort, meaning that even at this stage Sullivan does not want us to succeed, and it makes sense that he wants to stop us. He effectively has taken control of the world as it is. He is the de facto ruler of this fading world, and our actions threaten his position. No matter our choice at the end of the game, whether we link the fire or we let it fade, or we become the Lord of Hollows, each of these outcomes would result in the end of the Pontiff's rule, and so he hounds us every step of the way. Vort and the other Boreal Knights confront us at pivotal moments in our journey, and we even face some of his knights in the Grand Archive of Lothric. We of course face the Dancer when we unlock the ladder up to Lothric Castle, and in my opinion, she is here on the orders of the Pontiff, so that we are prevented from claiming Prince Lothric's scalp, given he is a Lord of Cinder, who we require to access the Kiln of the First Flame. Pontiff Sullivan's power base is massive. From his beasts, to the deacons, to his knights, he casts a long shadow indeed. This is of course not to mention that with the death of Gwyndolin, he is in sole charge of the world's largest church. For all intents and purposes, he is God. He hasn't just relied on his agents, however, as Pontiff Sullivan is an exceptionally powerful being in his own right. He is armed with the Greatsword of Judgment and the Profaned Greatsword. Additionally, he clearly has power over the Dark, given in Stage 2 he takes on a form similar to the Dark Lurker, and is able to duplicate himself like the Lurker. I take this as further evidence that the Deep is indeed linked to the Dark, given the Lurker, a creature of Dark, has similar powers to those displayed by Sullivan, who clearly has mastery of the Deep's power. However, the Deep is not the only source of his power, for the Profaned Greatsword reads the following. Long ago, when Sullivan was yet a young sorcerer, he discovered the Profaned Capital, and an unfading flame below a distant tundra of Irithyll, and a burning ambition took root within him. Again, this sword reinforces his ambition, given he would use a power as dangerous as the Profaned Flame for his weapon. We know from the Profaned Flame pyromancy that the flame of this capital went out of control and burned the Profaned Capital to ash, and this was after Yorm left to become a Lord of Cinder, and clearly the Giant Lord was the only reason the flame had been kept under control prior to this. We know from the Aristocrat's Mask that Sullivan essentially recruited the survivors of the capital to run his prison. And again, in this prison, we see an example of his cruelty, as these jailers mercilessly tortured those condemned here by Sullivan. Look, I could keep going on about Sullivan, and I do think that I need to revisit the lore of Sullivan, the Deep and Aldrich, in a future video. But for the scope of this video, I think what I have discussed will suffice. Sullivan is essentially the main villain of Dark Souls 3. His forces hinder and hunt us all throughout our journey. He has corrupted and overthrown the Way of White. He has sentenced countless to a life of torture within his prison. He fed Gwyndolin, the last of the gods, to Aldrich, condemning him to a slow and painful death, as no doubt he is still semi-aware while he is being slowly devoured by the Saint. He has rewarded his loyal knights with a fate worse than death, providing them with rings that slowly deform them into rabid beasts, again just so he can wield them against his enemies with no regard to their pain. A tremendously written character, who really has his tendrils wrapped around all of Lothric and Lordran. I think Bloodborne was the toughest of the games for me to decide on the most evil character, because there are so many characters within this world who have caused large-scale harm. At one stage I had the Moon presence in this section, because Flora is a different type of evil, a being that isn't cruel or malicious in the human sense, yet represents a cold, indifferent type of evil. Additionally, I think that the slaughter at the fishing hamlet is the single most tragic event that happens in any of the games, and the perpetrators of this act, Gehrman, Maria, and Bergenworth as an organisation, absolutely are monsters in their own right. And this is not to mention Lawrence, an arrogant individual who ignored the warnings of Willem to establish the Healing Church. Thus the horrors of the Research Hall and the Beast Scourge as a whole can be traced back to Lawrence. I had also at one point chosen Mikolash because of the mass suffering inflicted by the School of Mensis, their kidnappings, the mass murder in creation of the One Reborn, and in general, they were responsible for the extended Night of the Hunt, because it is they who have beckoned the moon so close. And yet, after a lot of thought, I have chosen fake Yosefka because her brand of evil is more deliberate and sadistic than the megalomaniacs I have mentioned. A cruel individual who has little regard for the people she personally mutilates. It is a more straightforward and personal evil compared to the others I've mentioned, but I think it is the manner in which she inflicts that has led me to choose her as my nomination. Her evil is further emphasized by the character she impersonates, the real Yosefka, a kind individual and one of the first people we meet in-game. If we return to the clinic we received our blood ministration at in the game's intro, we find the doors locked, but through the door a person speaks to us. This is Yosefka, and she says that she must keep the door locked for the safety of her patients. She wishes us luck on the hunt, and is happy to provide us with her blood, a powerful healing concoction. However, we can tell that she is replaced because after reaching Cathedral Ward, the woman at the door has a shift in her tone. She is no longer scared and gentle. Instead, this new woman now has a sort of glee and excitement in her voice. Additionally, she reintroduces herself to the hunter as if we are meeting her for the first time. Final confirmation of the real Yosefka's demise comes when we later enter the clinic from the alternative entrance, finding an experimented body holding one of Yosefka's blood vials. This is the real Yosefka, and clearly she was the first victim of the imposter. The imposter asks us to send humans to her clinic, telling us that it will act as a safe haven, yet the tone of her voice makes it quite clear that she has some ulterior motive, that once again becomes clear when we are finally able to enter the clinic. Each of the poor people we have sent here to get help have instead been transformed into a celestial emissary. We have been providing this person with subjects for her experiments. As to who this person is, we get the answer from both her outfit and the equipment she uses. She wears the iconic robes of the choir, and is also able to use Augur of Ibrataz and a Call Beyond, both of which are items of choir origins. We also find celestial emissaries in the orphanage of the choir, confirming that the transformation of humans into these kin-life forms is a practice of the choir. The choir are an organisation that are dedicated to trying to make contact with the cosmos, and the emissaries are great intermediaries in that regard. As their name suggests, they are considered to be a point of contact between the mundane and the cosmic. Again, I discuss all of this in detail in my choir lore video, and I would direct you there if you were interested in learning more. The suggestion is that this imposter is a choir member who came down from the orphanage during the night of the hunt, hoping to use the chaos as an opportunity to further her research. Yosefka's clinic provided the perfect lab, and we were the perfect tool to provide her with the materials that she needed. For me, the imposter is a chilling character, an unhinged scientist who takes advantage of the night of the hunt to callously experiment on people who were just seeking shelter. Bear in mind this can also include Gascoigne's daughter, a young girl, to which this imposter shows no mercy. The Dung Eater is genuinely one of my favourite characters in any of the FromSoftware games. From his visual design, to his voice acting, to his story, he is as compelling as he is revolting, and unlike with my Bloodborne nominee, the Elden Ring choice was incredibly easy. What Dung Eater does to his victims is disturbing, a grim violation that is both physically and spiritually violent. He commits these crimes without remorse, and it is clear from the way he speaks that he is nonchalant about the suffering he inflicts on others. He is a brutal murderer without parallel that would send chills down the spine of even the most seasoned warrior. The Dung Eater is a tarnished like the player character, and we learn this via the opening cinematic where he is listed alongside other tarnished, who have been resurrected by grace and summoned to the lands between. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we see that prior to his resurrection, he was being hanged by a mob, likely a community found outside the lands between, who lynched him after his awful crimes were discovered. And no wonder, for the Dung Eater's methods are brutal indeed, and we can find his victims littered throughout the lands between, bloodied and usually bound to chairs. The character Boggart seems like a tough man, and yet when we speak to him about the Dung Eater, he is visibly shaken. He tells that he was once a prisoner alongside the Dung Eater, and that he witnessed what he did to his victims. That's why it is so unpleasant that Boggart himself falls victim to the Dung Eater's predations. Yet he is of course too disturbed by his memory to give us a visceral description, but if we speak to the Dung Eater himself, he does give us an insight into what it is he actually does.
I can kill you and defile your corpse, then the pox will truly be your own.
So he does something transgressive that curses the victim. In my Dung Eater lore video, I put forward a suggestion as to why he is called such, and what this procedure could be. And if I am right, it is indeed very repulsive and vile. In some Japanese folklore there is a concept known as the shirikodama, and this is a hard ball, found within the anus that contains one's soul. In this same folklore, there are the kappa, a mythical goblin creature who seek to steal this ball, and thus the victim's soul, via the behind. We actually already see this idea explored in a FromSoft game, Sekiro, where the headless enemy type have a sort of grab attack, where they appear to devour the shinobi's soul, via his anus. So he is not a Dung Eater in the literal sense, rather he is a soul eater, but does it in the most gruesome and transgressive way imaginable, violently defiling his victim in a physical and spiritual way. We can see the result of his curse in-game, as on every victim's body we find that a seedbed curse has been cultivated. Again, reading this item description can help us understand what it is that he is doing to these unfortunates. The item description for the seedbed curse reads as follows: curse grown on a corpse, killed and defiled by the Dung Eater. A tender pox, afflicted with omen horns. The Dung Eater cultivates the seedbed curse on corpses. By doing so, he prevents dead souls returning to the Erd Tree, leaving them forever cursed. One of the most loathsome things found in all the lands between. You can see from the object image that this is no ordinary curse, it is the omen curse, as is indicated by the horns growing on it. In turn, this tells us about the nature of the omen and, in part, why they are so reviled by the Golden Order, as their souls are disconnected from the Erd Tree. Under Marika's rule, the Erd Tree became the nexus of all life, and any being not connected to its power are seen as impure, such as those who live in death and the omen. But why is the Dung Eater a tarnished spreading the omen curse? What is it to him? Well, it likely hasn't escaped your notice that the Dung Eater is wearing armour that mimics an omen with his horns cut off. The helm of this armour set reads as follows: malformed helm resembling an omen with its horns cut off. Worn by the Dung Eater, their form is a vision of the landscape of his mind, and of his appearance as he wished to see it. The heart of an omen without the body to match. Could there be any crueler existence? What does it matter then, if the curse claims at all? It seems as though the Dung Eater himself wanted to be an omen. But why? Well, perhaps it is as simple as the fact that he sees himself as an outsider to society, much like the omen themselves. However, I think the real reason is far darker, and yet more simple. The Dung Eater revels in suffering, even his own. He genuinely talks with glee about his grand plan to have everyone cursed. Cursed individuals who themselves will go out and kill and spread the curse. He even calls his curse a blessing. Dung Eater's Sun Medallion, as described by his armour's chess piece, is a symbol of his ultimate aim, to create the mending rune of the Fell Curse, an artifact that would spread his curse through all of Order and all life. The Dung Eater has no noble intent, has no grand vision to make things better. He just wants to drag everyone down to a miserable existence, and he revels in the suffering he spreads. Before we move on to the final chapter, in which I will name who out of these 6 I believe is the most evil, I do want to acknowledge some honourable mentions who I considered, but ultimately passed over. The first is the old monk from Demon Souls, the once consort to the Ivory Queen, who willingly brought destruction and death to her great kingdom, purely out of spite. He coveted her power, and his greed is what brought so much suffering to Latria and its inhabitants. The reason he didn't take the #1 spot for Demon Souls is mainly because his crimes are basically a smaller scale version of Alliance, with the king instead bringing suffering to all of Boletaria and its client kingdoms. Additionally, Alant is still aware and unrepentant, whereas the old monk himself is no more, having been taken over and then abandoned by the Golden Robes. Aldia, as I mentioned, was someone I considered for the Dark Souls 2 nomination. A scientist who used people like cattle, determining that the greater good was more important than ideas such as morality. However, I do believe Nashandra is akin to an evil incarnate, again someone who revels in what they do, whereas Aldia at least believed there was some point to the suffering he inflicted. For Dark Souls 3, you could just as well have chosen Aldrich over Sullivan. There is no doubt that Aldrich is a depraved individual, but I believe the suffering Sullivan inflicted was on a much wider scale and had far more wide-reaching consequences. And of course you would be forgiven for choosing the likes of Gwyn or Marika, 2 beings at the top of the pyramid, who subjugated, purged, and oppressed people on a wide scale, mainly to retain their own power base. And as for Bloodborne, I do also believe the Moon Presence does represent a cosmic evil, a calculating being that uses the hunter and the dream in order to achieve its goals. But because it is an eldritch being, I am not confident enough in naming it the most evil character of that game, as I feel it does go a fair bit beyond our human concept of the word. I also already mentioned a flurry of other characters who could easily take that game's nomination, Lawrence and Mikolash just to name a couple, and I do suspect that fake Yosefka might be my most controversial choice. This is all just my opinion, and it is a subjective matter, and so with that said, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on who the most evil character is in the comments below. But without further ado, let us get to who I believe is the most evil character in all of Soulsborne and Elden Ring. I wasn't entirely sure who I would choose before writing this video, but having written out the nature of each of these characters' evil, I do believe that the Dung Eater takes the prize, and as such, he is my personal choice for the most evil character in the series. A lot of these other characters are cruel and despotic, but they all usually have some greater goal or vision in mind, even if that goal is power. Yet Dung Eater's goal is nothing more than cruelty itself. His depraved acts are not just a means to an end, suffering is the point. This is not even to mention the sickening nature of the defilement he inflicts on his victims. There are few things as grim in the world of Elden Ring, and it is made all the worse because of the joy he takes in what he does. Dung Eater's son Medallion is clearly a nod to Solaire of Astora, the jolly knight from Dark Souls 1 who also wore a sun emblazoned on his chest. Yet these two characters could not be more different in their nature and morals. Solaire, for all his faults, is a paragon of honour, a knight who will defend anyone who calls upon him, and is ultimately pursuing a noble goal. The Dung Eater is a perversion of everything Solaire stands for, and by paying homage to the wholesome Sunbro, the Dung Eater's darkness is made all the more apparent. A deeply evil, cruel, and depraved murderer, who, in my opinion, absolutely deserves the title of the most evil character in Soulsborne and Elden Ring. So that's it guys, that is my take on who the most evil character in Soulsborne and Elden Ring is. As I said, I would absolutely love to hear your take on this interesting discussion in the comments below. I absolutely loved making this video as it really whetted my appetite for diving back into Demon's Souls, Dark Souls and Bloodborne lore again, so I will do that in the near future. I would finally like to thank everyone for watching and for the support of my Patreon members. But until next time folks, I will see you in the lands between. Take care, and have a wonderful evening.